Hey, folks, welcome back to the Unbeatable podcast. This is your host, Mark Devine. Thank you so much for joining us today. Super appreciate your time and attention, and I don't take it for granted. I know what's vying for your attention out there. It's a lot, so I appreciate you being here. And if you do enjoy this show, please consider rating it wherever you listen to podcasts, iTunes in particular, and refer it to a friend. I'm super excited to have Dr. Amishi Jha. I'm super excited to have Dr. Amishi Jha today. And we have a lot in common because she is passionate about cognition and contemplation, two things that are near and dear to us at Unbeatable Mind. She is actually something I've never heard of before, but a cognitive and contemplative neuroscientist. Can't wait to find out what that really is. She's presented her work to Dalai Lama, NATO, Pentagon, many other important sounding folks. She's got a TED Talk, How to Tame Your Wandering Mind, and she's the director of Contemplative Neuroscience for the Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative, which she co-founded. She received her Ph.D. from Davis, did postdoc work at the Brain Imaging and Analysis Center at Duke, and she's the author of a recent book called Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 minutes in a day. Amishi, thanks so much for being here, and thank you for your work.
Oh, it's great to be here, Mark.
Yeah, and I know you're coming to us from Miami while I'm in California. So leveraging the beauty of Zoom and technology in this age of accelerating compression of time and confluence of accelerating technologies, right? Which I call the exponential, right? Age requires an exponential mindset. And I think that your work is right at the center of that idea or that notion of leaders, actually not just leaders, but anybody, really requiring to upgrade the way they use their mind/brain, because, it's just not tuned or built to function in this environment, right? So I'd love to start getting to know you by asking how you got interested in this field and what led you to your studies at Davis and whatnot. And so give us a little of your background before we get into nuts and bolts of Peak Mind.
Sure. So I was interested in psychology pretty early on. I thought I was going to be a medical doctor for quite some time in my, I guess, high school, early college years. And I realized pretty quickly this was not something I probably could pursue because I just didn't like being in the hospital. I frankly just could not be around that climate and that environment and didn't feel like I could do my best professional work there. So that was a little bit of a bummer since I was thinking in those terms for a very long time, at least, since I was a kid. But I lucked out because as somebody who'd already been interested in sort of consciousness and the mind, even as a high schooler, I was placed on one of my volunteering rotations in the hospital into a brain injury unit. And then that was sort of it. I was like, I'm not going to be able to pursue treating people with disorders of the brain even, but I can't wait to study this thing. And part of the thing that drove my interest in wanting to study it is, to me, it was incredible that we could change the nature and functioning of our own brain through things that we did. And I saw this very plainly and very directly with some of the patients that I was able to interact with. So they were mostly brain injury patients, some stroke, some tumor, but for the most part, people that had some kind of traumatic brain injury, and they were there to receive, as inpatients actually, intensive physical therapy and maybe speech therapy, etc. But I was seeing transformation. And I remember one patient in particular who I thought initially was a quadriplegic. But several weeks into seeing him and spending time with him, I realized, because he was all of a sudden in a new wheelchair and he could move himself using his fingers, that he was regaining function. And he said the most kind of amazing thing to me. He said, even though I go to physical therapy during the day and I'm trying my best, I still practice at night. When I'm falling asleep, I visualize myself moving my finger in this systematic way. And that to me was amazing. It's like he's sitting here in the dark by himself, changing his mind for the better to improve his functioning. And of course, now fast forward, you and I both know that mental training in this way is just a very powerful visualization tool. But that inspired my interest in this topic. And made me want to dig into anything that could transform the brain for the better.
That's fantastic. I love that. Now, this idea of neuroplasticity is actually relatively new, isn't it? I mean, it really, maybe it's new in the mainstream thinking, but like, how long have we known that you can actually train your brain? Certainly when I grew up, or change your brain through training or through, things like bilateral stimulation or visualization. When I grew up, it certainly was thought gospel that, your brain cells just kind of die and your brain will degrade over time, and you got what you got.
It's pretty depressing news.
It
Yeah.
is. I know.
You're going to
And it's,
grow,
and
your
it's
brain's going to
flawed,
be good for
like
a good 10 years stretch, and then you're done. It's
you're
just a
done. Yeah.
downward slog. Yes. And it was actually in my second or third year of grad school that the discovery had been made that adults can grow new neurons. And that was a pretty game changing thing, because even early days of grad school, the view that you're born with a certain number of cells, they proliferate through adolescence, then they prune away, and then the adult brain is pretty much going to be stable and then start diminishing in its kind of
What was that
cellular.
year? What, like, how many years ago
I
did you
think
do that?
maybe 95, 94, 95.
Okay.
So
Yeah. So
not that
about
long ago.
25 years ago, so it's been some time. We've had some time of understanding this, but most people still don't really get it. There's so many myths about the brain. The other myth being that we only use 10% of our brain, which is a total malarkey, right? We use 100% of it. We may not use it very effectively, right?
No, we use 100% of our brain. I love Morgan Freeman, but I blame him for proliferating the myth in modern times. And then Bradley Cooper comes along and says, it's not 10%, it's 20%. I'm like, still wrong,
Right.
still wrong. So no, we use the entirety of our brain. And I would say, the notion of neuroplasticity is not new per se, because we knew that we could change the brain for the worse. And in some sense, that is neuroplasticity too. Experience can change the brain, and that experience could be a problematic experience that leads to something that happens, or disease states or injury. And we also knew that probably you could regain some of that just through certain things that you did.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I think really helped motivate more research in this area is looking at healthy people and looking at brain changes and brain training in healthy people using the tools of functional brain imaging.
Mm-hmm.
And functional brain imaging also around the same time, actually mid 90s, really it started coming on the scene. I remember I was one of the first graduate students that was voluntold to check out the new MRI scanner. Like, get in there, Amishi, see what you think.
And you're like, whoa.
That's when I discovered I'm extremely claustrophobic. So
Those are very, very intimidating, by the way. I mean, of course, most of us have been in one.
yeah. But now we're not just, you're not going in there to get your knee scanned or your back scanned or whatever. You're in there for an hour and a half doing intensive cognitive tasks, and then responding with a little MRI compatible keypad. So you're kind of playing these simple video games in there for very long periods of time, because we need enough trials to be able to then do the statistical analysis. So it was a different deal, but you're right. I think this has not reached current consciousness, sort of cultural consciousness, but the time is ripe for that to happen. And I think the kind of work you do helps promote this understanding.
Right.
And of course, the work I do, just to finish the thought, is intended to make sure that whatever we want to promote is evidence-based.
I was just going to say that. Thank you for that. That's been kind of a thorn in my side, because, most listeners, or unless they're new listeners, would know that, I got my start in mental training through Zen at 21. And it literally, it changed everything about who I was, to the point where I was an MBA CPA working on Wall Street. I literally threw it all away to become a Navy SEAL.
Wow.
And it was all the changes, 21 through 24 years old, that were happening in my brain from sitting on that Zen meditation bench, and then long sit sessions up at the Zen Mountain Monastery in Woodstock, New York. And it was so powerful and so transformative that, of course, as a foundational experience in my life, I said, wow, check that out. So I continued my training and then added and adapted it, of course, because as a SEAL, I was always traveling and always fatigued. And, so it wasn't that easy to just sit on a little bench, because I absolutely fall asleep right away. And so I had to figure out how to practice kind of on the fly while I was doing other things. So it became like mindful movement. And so my workout became a meditative practice, right? Time sitting on the beach waiting for the submarine to pick me up became meditative practice. And it was profound. And so when I started teaching this to SEALs and then civilians, it was all based upon my experience. It was all subjective, and nobody believed me until they could experience themselves. And it really has been that way until very recently, when I can start to say, oh, well, look, well, there's some research on breathing techniques. See, I wasn't just making this shit up. And here's some research on mindfulness. Yeah, I wasn't making this shit up. And here's some research on visualization. And guess what? If you pull all those things together, right, you have this magic that happens in your brain. Anyways, I went off on a little tangent there, because this idea of being able to finally validate through the work of yourself and others what many of us who kind of got into the contemplative practices, or whether it was from a spiritual tradition or a performance tradition, it's very, very exciting. And so the two are finally coming together.
Absolutely. And I feel for you, because in some sense the proof was in the transformation.
That's
You
right.
were you were the extreme case study that shows the incredible power and transformative effects of these practices. But of course, you're right also to say that when it's an N of one, as we say, one participant, a case study, we don't have a different Mark Divine that's gone through the exact same experience but didn't practice Zen and see how he ended up. So this notion of longitudinal, of cross-sectional studies, as we might say. So take people that on their own decided to practice for whatever reason, were motivated to practice, practiced intensively. And then even they were some of the initial people. So monastics, for example, people that have had long-term practices, decades-long practices, bring them all, sort of lump them all together and say, okay, you all are mindfulness meditation practitioners. Please come to the lab and get inside our MRI and let us look at your brain structure and function. And then we're going to take people that are age and education matched, and we're going to group them together and have them come in and do the same thing and say, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Different. Definitely different looking brains, and not just random, but in specific brain circuits and brain networks that were tied to the nature of the practice. So that was, those initial studies were quite eye-opening for many people to say, look, it isn't just in my head, so to speak, it's actually changing my brain. But even those get quite criticized because, like I said, we don't know. For the people that chose to do these practices on their own, they may have been different before.
To begin with, right? Yeah.
To begin with, right? So now we're moving toward the term I used earlier, longitudinal studies, where we're actually tracking people, randomly assigning them to get the training versus not, having them come in and track them over time, and then see, is it the case that the nature of the change from the period of time that they've been practicing is tractable through our brain imaging and performance metrics. And those are more of the gold standard research designs. And those are also suggesting that yes, we can track beneficial
and that takes time. I did some work with and some study training practice with a fellow out of Harvard named Dan Brown, or Dr. Daniel Brown. And he's involved in the Zazen tradition, the Tibetan. And so his practice is called The Pointing Out Way, and his book is called The Great Way. And he's done a lot of really cool stuff. But they've been able to do a longitudinal study with people who, come to and just begin training with them and then track them over the years. And the results are quite extraordinary. And they have individuals who've reached, what he claims is the enlightenment state in about 6 or 7 years through a disciplined daily practice, which is pretty extraordinary. Now that's using metaphysical terms. So it'd be interesting to see, what does that enlightened state look like in a biomechanical and electrical structure of the brain, right? That would be fascinating.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, say it again.
That wasn't exactly what you're talking about, but it's this idea that we can track these meditation, students, and to see what effect it's having on their physiology. Right.
Absolutely. And I think that my bigger point was just like, I feel your pain, because frankly, I was almost on a very parallel, I wouldn't even put it parallel. I was on like the baby version of your journey. I didn't become a Navy SEAL, but what I was going to say is that
but you could have.
I don't know. But what I was going to say is that I, in some sense, landed where you did in this sense. I gravitated toward mindfulness almost kind of grudgingly. I mean, I grew up in an Indian family. I know you have an interest in yogic practices, etc. And yeah, in my family life, meditation was not like a surprising thing. It was part of what most people, especially my parents, did.
Right.
I rejected it, frankly. I just thought that's for them, not for me, not interested, no thank you.
Were they
And
here in America
yeah,
or
yeah, I grew up in
oh,
Chicago. So,
Chicago?
they
Okay.
brought, as many immigrant families do, they brought the practices with them. And I could see that it was beneficial. I mean,
Yeah.
my mom's a yoga practitioner. Um, she's been practicing for a long time. And I see the value in her life, but I definitely, and this was probably when I had my first faculty position at the University of Pennsylvania before I moved down to the University of Miami, I felt like I, well, I was not interested growing up in any of it. In fact, I rejected it for multiple reasons. Just, that's you. I'm here. I'm a Western trained neuroscientist. We're
Mhm.
going to do things that are empirically validated, and with probably a bit of hubris that I knew what I was doing somehow. And then in that early period of my professional life, when I had just started my own lab at the University of Pennsylvania, it was a very intense time in my life. I had small children. My husband was in grad school. I was starting my own lab for the first time on the tenure track, and
Mm.
we had just bought a whole fixer-upper in West Philly. And it was just like every possible kind of thread of my life felt like it was, wow, this is a lot.
Mhm.
And there's all stuff I want, but it's a lot. And I had lost feeling in my teeth from grinding.
Interesting.
And I was like, looks like something's up. And had to figure out what to do because I professionally studied the brain's attention system and ironically could not keep a hold of my own attention at all. It was like, it was like water through my fingers. I just couldn't hold on to it. And kind of was like, okay, well, we're just going to study this like everything else. We're going to take a rigorous approach. Let's analyze the literature. Let's look to see what are solutions that people use to get their attention back when they're overly distracted. And of course, I came in completely empty handed. There was nothing I could look to. And I started feeling kind of angry, like, why this field that I thought was coming quite far along with regard to attention had a real blank spot regarding the phenomenology of distractibility and the
Mhm.
mental training one might do, or other forms of training, or even technology to improve it. Anyway, I'd heard about mindfulness meditation from a colleague, actually a very eminent neuroscientist, Richie Davidson, who has started doing those studies with monastics in his
Mhm.
lab. This was early 2000s, so he hadn't published many of those yet, but it got me curious enough and I respected him enough that I was like, let me just check it out. I started practicing on my own. About 4 to 6 weeks later, felt amazingly different, felt
Mhm.
completely like none of the demands had changed in my life, but I was able to know where my mind was. I was able to focus on my son's face or have a non-reactive conversation with my spouse, address
Mhm.
the challenges of my work life in a productive manner. So, you know, what my pivot point was after feeling that transformation, I became extremely curious. And I said, wait a second, I have all the tools in my lab to study attention and the transformative effects and the brain science tools that might help us see what the transformative effects might be. So let's bring it into the lab. Let's do the rigorous research. And so I would say a lot of that same pain point of like, why is this, there's no objective metrics on this? Well, let's just get those.
That's
So I'm
fascinating.
happy that we were able to take that turn. And I hope that, you know, for you, now that you can point to larger literature, people are more convinced than they might have been by your case study because they might have just thought you're an amazing guy and maybe that was just you and they couldn't do it
That's
themselves.
right.
But
Yeah, and I did deal with a lot of that. Oh, that's you, but you're special, and I'm not sure we can do that. So we have to
right,
kick against that kind of guru mentality.
yeah,
So how would you define peak mind in the title of your book?
yeah. I mean, it really comes from again my specific specialization in the topic of attention.
Hmm.
And attention, what I mean when I say that term is having full access, full capacity of our attentional resources, and kind of complementing that, the capacity to stave off distractibility
Hmm.
so that we can meet the challenges that we face in our lives and have fulfillment in our lives.
Right.
So it really is honing in on the notion of what attention is, understanding the ephemeral nature of what it is, just like I was saying, slipping through my mind, slipping through my hands in some ways, and then training for betterment by harnessing this power we already have.
Right. a very foundational training from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is the elephant path. And the elephant path, has you essentially go deeper and deeper into your own attention, and then intentionally begin to work with your attention. So it starts out simply by trying to hold your attention on one spot, like one point, and that's the breath. And to follow the breath all the way up, and to very, very discrete steps in the inhale all the way to the turnaround, then the exhale all the way to the turnaround. And so that is, like boot camp. And that's very similar to my Zen training. Like this is just like laser beam focus your mind just on this, right? But then part two was recognize that, your mind doesn't do that very well, and it's difficult to do that. And what's actually happening is one of two things: your mind is wandering off of that, and then you have to bring it back, or you've got half your mind on that and half your mind on something else. So like split attention or complete distraction.
Yeah.
And then the third, I could go on and on. We won't do that, but then you have to learn, like to notice when those are happening and to bring it back quicker and quicker. So this is what you're talking about. First, we learn how to hold our attention on something that we desire, that's productive. But then we have to figure out how to stave off that distractibility. They're kind of hand in glove skills. They're not exactly the same. This is fascinating that you came, that was the outcome of your research, because it is, in a sense, laid out by these meditation traditions that go back thousands of years.
I mean, I tell you that some of the most gratifying conversations were with people like Buddhist scholars to say,
Right.
what is it's like I all of a sudden encountered a whole tradition of amazing hypotheses regarding the brain and the mind that we could put to the test.
Right.
And what I love about somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama is he's like, basically, his interest in science, like if you find something that makes us really need to question our views, we'll consider that. Like we're not
Right.
so tied to these hypotheses. I loved that. I was like, he's a
right, because they didn't have access to modern medicine. They weren't looking and slicing and dicing the brain. They were just,
Exactly.
trying to
Yeah.
interpret their experiences.
But I think what you'll find even more interesting than what we're talking about, the parallels, is when I started reading about this and practicing myself, I realized a lot of the Buddhist texts have already started thinking about or describing the multiple systems of attention in the brain.
Right.
So, and maybe I could say a little bit about that, because I think it connects back to what you were saying about how we train it and why that would be effective.
Right.
In terms of the trajectory of first focusing on a target object, noticing the nature of the mind and its distracted nature, reminding ourselves of what the goals are, redirecting attention back. That whole sequence, and then the cultivation of insight and wisdom through that practice, right, moment by moment in our lives. When I heard those types of instructions, and even when I started practicing myself, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like all the components are the things we've been studying in the lab.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, one of the major systems of attention, called the orienting system, the way I'd like to talk about it is it's like a flashlight. So if you're in a darkened room or a darkened path, you describe being on the beach waiting for the submarine, which is like, oh my gosh, you need to have that flashlight to be able to make your way, right? Get the information in a very discrete way. And that orienting system does that. It actually tweaks the signal to noise ratio so that we are much better able to get crisp, clear information of where we direct our attentional flashlight, if you will, and everything around us is dulled down. Yeah. And the kind of evolution for why we even developed that is interesting, because, the human brain, in some sense, and even prior to when we were human brains, just our evolutionary ancestry, the brain suffered this giant problem, which is that all of a sudden, the organism's job is to make its way in the world and interact with the environment to survive, but it wasn't able to get full access to what's happening in the environment because it didn't have the complexity to do that, and the nature of the environment was very complicated. So in some sense, this orienting system, this flashlight metaphor, is a way to subsample the environment. It's like, oh, I see what's going on here. Now I see what's going on here.
Right?
Say it again?
And conserve energy.
Well,
which is a big need for the brain, right?
Yeah, conserve energy in some sense, but it's going to be needing to use all of its computational resources in order to analyze what's coming in.
Right.
So it can't analyze everything, but it can use all that it has to fully know the thing it's focusing on. kind of
And
bit
would
by
you
bit.
say that that flashlight is a, let's use familiar terminology,
Yeah.
left brain function, whereas the information that's just being absorbed is really contextual in the right brain, and or largely below conscious awareness. So conscious awareness is our ability to make sense out of something and to shine that flashlight on something and to make meaning of it, whereas everything else kind of resides somewhere below the tip of that iceberg.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I would say just be aware that a lot of the left brain, brain stuff is getting debunked now.
I
So
totally agree with that. Right.
just put that to the side. Let's
Put that
pretend we
aside.
don't
I
even
want to
need
come
those.
back to that because I want to understand that more, because I've read that and I heard that and it makes sense to me, but I'm curious about like what's
Well, the
missing.
shorthand I'd just say is the brain is dynamic and interactive. So the notion that it can be parsed in a hemispheric manner is just not the way it works. And the better tools we have, the more we're able to see that. But to answer your question, yes, when we talk about attention, all aspects of attention, and so far we've only talked about one, there's two others that I think are important to talk about. We're talking about the thing that is the contents of our current conscious experience.
Right.
Wherever it is that we direct that flashlight, we get access to that information that comes in this crisper, clearer manner.
Mm-hmm.
And the really cool part is, though it may have developed to be able to sample the external environment, we can use that same flashlight to probe internally.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now, if you have an idea and you want to pursue that train of thought, you're essentially shining the flashlight on the concept to kind of continue proliferating it.
Yeah.
So it's very similar, internal and external. The one thing, though, is that it also gets used, that same function gets used automatically and gets yanked. So now, you're on that beach waiting for the sub to pick you up or some indication of what's going on, and you hear some kind of strange rustling behind you.
Mm-hmm.
You literally take the flashlight and look. And that's also the case. The orienting system is both voluntary and can be directed, but it can be pulled by different kinds of stimuli.
Yeah.
And kind of going back to what you were saying regarding the Buddhist perspective, this is where a lot of the insight comes in. It's like in the external environment, we know if things are threatening, uncertain, loud, salient, even self-related, that flashlight's going to get yanked to them. We're evolutionarily predisposed to, for survival reasons, orienting quickly to that kind of content. But if we have a disturbing thought, a frightening thought, if we're preoccupied about ourselves, that flashlight gets yanked internally and may stay there for very long,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is part of the insight we can gauge regarding our vulnerabilities of mind and destructive emotions, etc.
Right. And that's almost a whole nother strand of thought/research and practice, is how to disengage from that stress response, that reactionary conditioning. I mean, it exists for a very important reason, but we can train to control it and to become less reactionary and to control the hormonal response so it's not debilitating. That's a large part of what we do in Navy SEAL training, believe it or not. We call that arousal control.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very effective. So the combination of attention control and arousal control are very important for special operators, because we need to be able to control attention without the extreme distraction. If the bomb goes off behind us, like, we stay focused on the target.
That's right.
We don't knee jerk react and have that cortisol dump and whatnot. These are very important. Those two are very important. I wanted to say something because you brought up this flashlight analogy is also another one that pops up again and again in different traditions, right? And one I've heard, which is really cool, is like when you are untrained, it's like you're holding the flashlight like you described, and you're kind of like searching, and it's like you're attached to the flashlight like you're attached to your thoughts. And with practice of mindfulness, you develop this separation, and suddenly, like, you become the flashlight, right? There's no you holding the flashlight. You are completely aware of everything, and your thoughts are out there. You're not attached to them anymore. So you get to choose. So that's one really cool kind of connection there. And the other one is this, in the Taoist tradition, there's a practice, or they call it turning the light around. And so the idea here is very simple, that most people, or an untrained mind, is completely merged with thought, like the flashlight, just focused fully outward. There's no internal introspection, no turning around. So then, when you start to practice, like you described, you turn the light and you look inward. And so then what happens is you begin to recognize that there's two versions of you, right? There's the thought structures and the emotional structures, and there's the version of you that's looking at the thought structures and emotional structures. And that's a huge leap for most people, just to recognize and to create that metacognitive awareness, and then to continue that journey until you become fully identified with the seer, what we call the witness. That's extraordinary. And it's completely trainable with just a little bit of work, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's neat for me is it's, again, going back to kind of the lens that I take on this, which is attention research, it's tapping into two other brain systems of attention. So
Yes.
the flashlight is really just the directing of this kind of mental energy to get a high signal to noise ratio. This is signal important, everything else not. But the next system after that, that we should probably talk about, because it connects exactly to what you're saying of this notion of seeing and meta awareness, is what we call the alerting system, right? So this is something that is, the metaphor I like to use is like a floodlight, or sometimes people say like a fog light. It's just broad and it's receptive.
Scanning.
And it's, sorry?
Scanning almost.
No, it's not scanning.
It's not.
Scanning would be the flashlight moving.
Right.
This is more like broad and receptive to just what's going on. So you're the stable observer and you're allowing whatever's coming in to be noticed. Now, obviously, there's going to be aspects to that. If something is noticed, you're going to take the flashlight and kind of interrogate it. So they always work hand in hand. But, you know, the thing to say about this system is it doesn't advantage anything. It is low signal to noise. There's nothing that's signal, nothing that's noise. It's actually, you don't know what signal and noise. So
it's
you're
not judging at all. It's just
exactly. So, you know, if we want to go back to kind of the real world experience of this for people that aren't established Zen or Dzogchen practitioners, really what we're talking about is you're driving down the road or you're walking down the road, you see a flashing yellow light, just a flashing yellow light, not a yellow traffic light, just a flashing light, usually around a construction site or maybe a school zone or a strange traffic pattern. What do you do? What is your mind like in that moment? Probably alert and vigilant, receptive to whatever's going to happen, because you don't know. You don't know if you're going to see a strange traffic pattern or children are going to run into the street. You have no idea, but you're vigilant and receptive. That's the kind of state we're talking about. And that the interesting thing is, remember I said like at the outset that attention kind of most broadly you could say is advantaging some information over other information. That's why the brain developed it. With the flashlight, we're advantaging based on the content. It's like this part of space, or what's the feeling in my toe, or that particular train of thought. With the floodlight, we're advantaging a particular moment in time. Frankly, right now. We're advantaging right now. What is occurring right now without any concern regarding the content. So I think that, you know, I think we can talk about how training that and cultivating that as it relates to the flashlight even and their interrelationship can be part of what you're describing as a different way to orient toward mental content, which is instead of immersed and sort of fused with the experience, being able to take that floodlight approach to our own experience.
Gosh, there's so many parallels and metaphors. I want to come back to this idea that presence is kind of the antidote to panic, right? Because it's so true. And that's a profound statement that you make, and I want to come back to that. But there's two things that I think you'd be kind of excited to hear that, like, we teach in the special ops, right? One is this idea of training your mind to be radically focused while simultaneously situationally aware.
Yeah.
It's similar to if you had a sniper and a spotter. The sniper is just focused on that one thing, his target, and the spotter's looking at everything, the air, you know, the breeze, the sun, you know, what's going on. And so to train your mind to have both of those online simultaneously, there's this term called simultaneous mind. I don't think it means exactly that. I've used it in that context though. And then the other thing that I teach my people who follow what I do is this color system around awareness. And white is complete ignorance and like default mode, just kind of rambling through life and reacting to things. And then yellow is a trained mind that is basically learned not to be ever in white, but to always be in yellow. And yellow is when I said the term scanning, I use the metaphor of a radar, passively scanning, not actively pinging, but passively scanning while you're going about your task. So that's the simultaneous mind.
Yeah.
And then orange constitutes what you described as high noise ratio or high noise to whatever
High
ratio.
signal to noise. Yeah.
High signal to noise ratio, where all of a sudden it's like boom, like in the context of a Navy SEAL, it's like, holy shit, there's right.
Yeah. Right there.
There's something. It's either
Yeah.
something I feel or I see an enemy. Shwoop. Now my focus radically collapses on that, but I don't completely take this offline, but I am bleeding off resources, let's say, because my attention is going to be really focused here. And so that's orange. I haven't exploded into action yet because that's red. Red is cortisol, adrenaline jump. Everything's focused on this. And you can use that in kind of any scenario, like driving down the road, getting cut off in the car. You go from white to red. And without any of these other steps in between, and it could be catastrophic, right? If you haven't trained. Anyways, I wanted to share that. I thought that'd be interesting for
it is very, very interesting. Not only, it's so funny because I'm sure you've also noticed that a lot of the kind of mental qualities that happen with elite warriors are also those that happen with sort of Olympians of the mind, monastics. That's
right. Yeah, like flow state. Like we know flow state because it just kind of happens with us because we train so relentlessly, and that kind of challenge level is always a little bit elevated, and our skill level is always a little bit just slightly below that. And that's what Shishmakala said is, you got to have those elements, and then you always just kind of click at that point into that flow.
Yeah. So I just want to mention that, so we talked about this flashlight, the floodlight, and there is a third system that I think is important to mention as we talk about training the mind in a way that optimizes, going back to your question about what a peak mind is. Right. And that third system, kind of broadly speaking, we call it executive control, which I'm sure is a term you've encountered and you've used.
Planning.
So executive control here is, broadly speaking, ensuring that, just like in the flashlight, it's content driven. That's how we're selecting. In the floodlight, it's here right now, what's happening. With executive control, it's goal based. So what is my goal for the moment, and what is my behavior, and are they aligned? And I'm checking that moment by moment. Yeah. So planning is a complex version of that. It's the constant coordination to ensure that my actions and my goals are aligned. And of course, it uses the other two systems in order to ensure that it is. It's optimizing those for that. But executive control has these features, and the metaphor I use for that is like a juggler, like you were saying, planning in some sense, but you're kind of keep all the balls in the air. There's a coordination aspect. You've got to maintain the goals moment by moment. You've got to ensure that you update goals. So situation changes, you got to change the goals. You got to inhibit things that are the wrong things that you don't need to do, and you got to shift. Yeah. So all of those kind of go into the bucket of executive control. Right. But that system is also so important in terms of training.
Right. Love that. So let's talk about what happens to these three systems when we try to multitask.
Good. So during multitasking, essentially, first of all, that term is a false.
It's impossible, term. Right? But
we don't multitask, right? So notice I didn't use the
shift, term, right? We go from one thing to another very fast.
I didn't say your flashlights of attention. I said flashlight. I said singular.
Right.
And in some sense, that is the truth. We have this capacity of the mind to collapse and narrow, to privilege some information. There's a singular aspect to it. Now, you can actually, in certain elite circumstances, kind of have two things that you're tracking, et cetera. But for the most part, if they're complex and attentionally demanding, it's going to be a singular focus, which goes back to the comment you just made that, so we're not multitasking if two things are attentionally demanding, we're task switching, which means that essentially if you go back to what I said attention does, which is use the entirety of the brain to recalibrate it in the service of processing whatever's going on. So the metaphor I like to use is like, if you think of the brain as like a studio apartment. So you got one brain, you got the small constrained space, a lot needs to happen within that. Right. Now I'm going to use the studio apartment to make my meal prep for the week. I'm going to make my great, delicious food. I got my vegetables and chopping supplies all over the whole apartment. Right. But now I got to do my taxes. So I got to put all that away and get my receipts out and everything like that. And, I can't have the food mixed in with my materials for my tax preparation. So then I got to put everything away, organize this, but now I got to go back to making the food. That's what we're doing with task switching, to attentionally demanding tasks. Whatever we engage in, we recalibrate the entirety of information processing. So now when we switch from one to the other, there's a time lag, there's an energetic cost, and the chances for mistakes are going to be greater.
Right. Well, there's a time to do it and there's a time not to do it, right? The time to do it is if you're getting the kids ready for school and you got to make their lunch and you got to cook breakfast and you got to comb their hair. And so that's one thing. And it all kind of comes together and they get out the door and there's no major disasters. But if you're a CEO, right? Or if you're a research scientist, or if
It
you're a
doesn't,
Navy
I mean, no,
SEAL.
no, no. I would say it doesn't matter. All of us are going to be in situations where we're going to have to task switch rapidly and efficiently. We're going to have to do it. It's just the
Right.
nature of the demands. All I'm saying is, in those moments, do it. But be aware of the vulnerabilities that you suffer
And
from.
the
It will
degradation of,
exhaust you.
right.
You are likely to make mistakes, and there's going to be a time lag. Knowing that will help you so that now when the kid's screaming, I don't have my waffle yet, and you're trying to comb the other one's hair, you're like, okay, I need a minute. I'll get you your
Take
waffle.
a
Let me
breath,
just
right?
get the brush out of her hair, whatever it is. So we can kind of down regulate our own frustration with ourselves because we know this is a natural thing that the brain has to deal with. But here's the other part of it. When you can, monotask instead.
Right.
Advantage yourself. Don't leave all the notifications open on every social media app and your phone on if you know you need to do deep work for a period of time.
Right.
So that's part of the culture change piece is like we need to, especially with the kind of groups that you talk to and executives and leaders and elite performers, don't multitask unless you absolutely have to because
Right.
you're
Because you're
disadvantaging
training your
yourself.
mind to be multitasking. Right.
Yeah, and you're disadvantaging your information
Just,
processing
right.
and exhausting your mind.
So deep work, deep focused, attention focused work will train your mind to remain deeply focused
Yeah, I mean,
on
in
what you
some
want to
sense,
do.
not necessarily because the mind you'll have a mix of having
Mhm.
to task switch versus not, but it's more like an intentionality to
I see.
monotask when you can. Most of us don't think in those terms. It's like we somehow think we're supposed to, or it's some kind of badge of honor to be doing 10 things at once.
Right. Yeah.
It's not. It's actually inefficient, and leaders shouldn't be doing it because they're harming their own productivity, their success, and they're making their decision making more vulnerable.
It's interesting. It's not just, like turning off the notifications and whatnot. It's literally actually, they've done studies. If you actually have your phone near you,
Yep.
it'll cause you to be less or more distractible for some
Yeah.
reason
And let's
because the
just
mind has been taught already to expect those that
absolutely.
dopamine hit. So it's going to be looking for it.
It's going to be looking for it. But even, let's take it even a step further. If you think about getting rid of everything, like now you're in your mountain retreat home by yourself and you're like, I'm going to do this deep work. You're going to have your own mind to contend with.
That's right.
And, one of the numbers I describe in my book is 50% as the sort of percentage of time where people's attention is actually in the task at hand.
Interesting.
So in those moments, where does the mind go? It's not going to your phone. You don't have a phone. It's not going to anything in the external environment. It's going to task unrelated thought. So you are
So,
now fast forwarding or rewinding your mind in,
right.
unfortunately, typically unproductive ways.
That's, I'm curious how you came to 50%, but also I wanted to relate that to this idea. You use the term simulation mode, which is probably very similar to default mode, which is kind of like ruminating about the future or kind of ruminating or regretting about the past, but it's not present.
It is how I came to it is actually looking at the brain systems that kept coming up with when we looked at the default mode. So the default mode is actually 3 subnetworks. When
Mm-hmm.
you look at the 3 subnetworks, all of them have a role to play in simulating reality. So
Mm-hmm.
it's taking you away from the here and the now to
Mm-hmm.
create alternative universes or to be in somebody else's mind. So it's both time travel and mind travel.
Right.
And those are not the current reality. Those are simulations that you're creating of reality.
Right. And
So
at the
yeah,
same time,
yeah.
they're incredibly powerful ways to use our brain if used with the right intention and some skill.
Well, that and when they're used with you knowing that you're using them.
That's
That's
right.
the tricky part of the simulation mode. We slip into it without knowing.
Fascinating.
Like just like if we're in that same mountain retreat and we're trying to read something, we get to the bottom of the page, nobody's bothering us. There's no technology. We get to the bottom of the page, have no idea what we just read. So that's typically we are mind wandering without awareness. We simulated some other reality. Our eyes are probably moving, which
Right.
led us to the bottom of the page. And so, what I think these practices are able to allow us to do, as you were alluding to earlier, is not only have better control of that flashlight and broad receptivity with the floodlight and have that executive control online to know what our goals are, but
Mm-hmm.
wrapped in all of that is what we'd call, I think you use the term metacognitive awareness. I just call it meta awareness,
Mm-hmm.
an awareness of where our mind is.
Right.
And that is similar to what you were saying. When I used earlier that term of taking the flashlight and making it go internal, I was still saying you were doing it from the very much a fused state. Like you're still holding the flashlight. What
Mhm.
you're talking about and what I'm talking about with meta awareness is literally it's taking a bird's eye view.
Right.
So you are watching the mind and aware that it is a mind experiencing certain contents and processes.
Absolutely. That's fascinating.
So, I wanted to just tell you that one of the projects that we did, I think you might be the first time I'm actually talking to a Navy SEAL. So this is exciting for me. But we did a project with special operators from a different service from the Army.
Mhm.
And, one of the questions that we were kind of struck by, because all of these things that we've been talking about, all three systems of attention, especially executive control and a related topic, working memory,
Mhm.
dialing down of default mode. There are individual differences in all of these, right? There's some people that are great at one and not so great at another. Like you can almost think of this like a mixing board, and everybody's got their set points.
Mhm.
We know that training and selection for special operators is like pushing everything up. There's an
Mhm.
elite level for all of these functions. So the project that we did was actually we offered uh, special operations forces a mindfulness training program.
Mhm.
And just to back up for a second, everything we'd learned from conventional forces was that if you take somebody that is enduring a high stress interval, so pre-deployment training, readiness training, deployment itself,
Mhm.
and you track their attention over some protracted high stress interval. So you get them at the beginning of this interval, 4 weeks later, you sample them again, and you just look to see how they perform. All three of these systems look like they're going to get worse.
Wow.
You
Interesting.
know,
Because
focusing
of
is
the
worse,
stress.
noticing is worse.
Right.
Well, overuse, inappropriate use, mind wandering. I mean, the list of reasons why you get this degradation is probably quite long, but reliably we see it over and over again. And what we found with mindfulness training offered to conventional forces is, and frankly, first responders and teachers and students, lots of different groups, they don't decline. So the control group that got nothing would decline over time.
Mhm.
The group that got the training stayed stable over time.
Mhm.
And that was very exciting, to
Mhm.
say, oh my gosh, we did something and nothing changed, which typically no researcher would be jumping up and
Right.
down for no change over time. But because we knew that the baseline was a degradation, we were pretty excited that we could see this stability over time. So now we're going to work with special operators. And I was like, oh gosh, they're not going to be normal people. I mean, sorry to say that. But I don't think we're going to see degradation was my strong hunch because we're selecting they've been selected to be elite in their functioning.
Right.
And so we run the study, and sure enough, we look at our control group's data, and no, they don't degrade. They're straight across for the group that got no training. Stability, even though they too were experiencing pre-deployment. In fact, some of them were deployed and coming back and going
Mhm.
again, like multiple deployments, because it's such a fast op tempo for operators. And so I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. We're going to offer mindfulness training, but they're so good. They don't even show any vulnerability.
Mm.
So we offer our training. And what we did is we took this 4-week program that we'd found over and over again was effective in conventional forces. Like I said, 4 weeks, mindfulness based attention training, do 12 to 15 minutes a day of mindfulness exercises. We could see stability over time. And we wanted to give that same program to these special ops people. But we said, if they are, we know they're elite, why don't we try to crunch the time? Let's even get even more time efficient. We'd worked for years to try to get a long program into
Mhm.
4 weeks. So we said, let's have one group. Let's get one group that got nothing. They showed stability, like I said. So we're already like, oh, this is not going to go well. Then we had one group that got this same program in a 2-week interval,
Mhm. Mhm.
and another group that got it in a 4-week interval. And the good news is that getting the program did something. In fact, we found that with the 4-week program, they significantly improved their
Mhm.
attention,
Right.
even though it was a pre-deployment interval,
Mhm.
but only for the 4-week group. The 2-week group did not show that benefit.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
fast
Yeah.
tracking it, again, going back to neuroplasticity and what it takes, just like changes in the body are going to take time, changes
Takes
in the
time.
brain are
Yeah.
going to take time. Fast tracking it was not a successful approach. But with 4 weeks of training, unlike conventional forces, special operators were able to increase their attention.
I'm curious. did you test the 2-week group right at 2 weeks or at the same 4-week period?
Same 4-week interval, and we told them to
Okay.
practice too.
Because I was
So
curious if the 2 weeks would have over time led to similar results.
no, in fact, it was actually a 6-week interval. So we had 2 weeks of training, or we had 4 weeks of training, and then we tested everybody 2 weeks after that. So everybody was tested in the same interval, and no, the 2-week training did not show a beneficial effect.
That's interesting. That is interesting to me, and it does say that, and what I've been I tell my people, it doesn't really do you much good if you meditate for 4 hours on Sunday once a week, right? But 5 to 10 minutes a day will have, transformative effect. So it's the consistency of practice over a long period of time.
And that's why.
And we also say, similar to kind of that data point, we say with our foundational box breathing practice, which is a stacked practice. So you get the arousal control through breathing slowly through your nose and the square breathing. And then, we have them concentrate and visualize a box while they breathe. So there's attention control and arousal control. And that's kind of the beginning. That 30 days is what is required for them to experience some significant benefits. But if you just do it for a week, you'll probably feel better, but then, you'll kind of go back to your stress state. So that was just kind of our experience. So it's kind of nice to see that kind of proven by your test a little bit. It takes at least 4 weeks. And that's just the beginning. If you do it for 6, 8, 10, 12, and then a year, imagine. Right.
Well, that, and also if you do more daily, we find that will benefit more.
Well, so let's talk about what is your prescription? You say 12 minutes a day in your book title. What's the prescription?
And the 12 minutes comes from actually asking people to do much longer than that. Some of the initial studies were 45 minutes a day. Nobody was doing 45 minutes a day.
People say they don't know.
And then when we started working with military cohorts and other kind of high demand professionals, we said, okay, 30 minutes, but just tell us what you actually do. We're researchers. Just put it in this envelope. The trainer's not going to see it. Just tell us. And what we found was that there was a dose response effect. The more people did, the more they benefited. But until we got to around 12 minutes a day over this 4 to 8 week interval, we didn't see any beneficial effects.
Interesting.
So that became sort of the threshold. Okay, there's something special about 12 minutes a day. Then we did follow-up studies where we only prescribed 12 minutes a day. We had guided practices that were 12 minutes a day, and we said, do them every single day. People did not do them every single day. Mm-hmm. So we said, okay, at what point do we start seeing it? Well, people were doing them a lot more frequently, and they were getting through the whole 12 minutes. We found that about 3 to 5 days a week of 12 minutes a day was where they were starting to show beneficial effects. So that's how...
That's so valuable. Yeah. That's so valuable, Amishi. I mean, because again, and right there, you just changed my entire program, because telling people it's better, to start with just 5 minutes is not going to lead to the benefits. It can't not have some benefit in my mind, but it's not going to accrue the full benefits. Right. Because if you just get a little pause and you get a reduction in your hormonal response and you're breathing through your nose and you get that stimulus of your vagus nerve being massaged. And there's a lot of benefit for that, but we're not talking about the mental neuroplastic benefit here.
Well, but here's the thing, right? What we're talking about, what you just described, would be in the moment enactment of a mindful orientation.
I love these terms you guys come up with. That's awesome.
I just made it up, but you are enacting that mindful mode in that moment. And what we're saying is formal practices. You're away from your regular life. You're sitting somewhere quietly and you're going to practice.
Right.
Now, the chances of you in the moment enacting or engaging in a mindful moment is going to be more readily available to you. And you're probably going to do it more on demand or on command, the more comfortable you are with it. So all we're testing is how much formal time they spend. Some of the more recent studies are looking at how often during the duty day, and these are actually boot camp folks, Army cadets, how often during the duty day do you informally engage in a mindfulness practice? And the way we do it, we offer it, is we say, and I'm sorry if this is getting too military, but I figured I'd talk to you.
This is fascinating, actually. So, and I love that there's actually this kind of work going on in the military now, because it wasn't going on when I was in the military. I brought my practice, and I had trouble even getting other people to listen to me. So I just kind of taught my little team and we went about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I feel like, to me, it's exciting because you were kind of pioneering these things, but now we have research grants that are allowing us to study them.
And the SEALs have actually full circle adopted some of our unbeatable mind techniques informally.
Awesome.
The director of mentorship down there. They recommends my book, Unbeatable Mind, and they practice box breathing and imagery. And so now it's, it's guerrilla warfare coming up from the bottom because the troops know they need it. And then, the top is studying mindfulness, and, eventually they'll sanction something and they'll completely forget about Unbeatable Mind.
No, I don't think so.
Or Mark Divine.
You just need to collaborate and do a couple studies together. That's all we need.
No, that's right. You're right. I need help in that regard.
But what I was going to say is that what we did is we took these mindfulness practices that were formal practices, which we can talk about, which are actually different than the box breathing. So we should probably touch on that if we can.
I'd like to, yeah.
But what we said is we want you to, every week we gave them a different formal practice of the 4-week program. But we also said we want you to engage in these informal practices. So for week 1, because, these are cadets, they're practicing basic things like standing at attention or standing at parade rest or standing at ease often, multiple times during the day. Mm-hmm. So we said for this week, every time you're standing at attention, we want you to attend to your breath-related sensations just multiple times during the day. Just use it as an opportunity to do a little informal check-in, find out where the heck your flashlight is. Second week was doing it during parade rest where they're checking out body sensations. Third week, it was during, what was it? It was like some other thing, like, what is it? What did I say? Parade rest.
Standing at attention, parade rest, probably when they're walking, right? Or marching.
Yeah, no, it was another way of, and it might have even been standing at attention again, but this time the instruction was monitor your environment. Mm-hmm. In that mindful orientation. So the point I'm making, and I don't remember all the details.
Those 3 different
exactly.
modes.
So it's tying it to the formal period of time they were doing the practices, but now throughout the day, multiple times a day, they're doing it. What that study showed is that 3 or more times of informally engaging in these practices had beneficial effects for things like anxiety and depression and mental toughness and even sick call. So it could have dollars and cents impact on, the health of the force based on just doing this informally.
I love that. That's completely consistent with what we call spot drills. And so we prescribe a routine practice in the morning, which is your sit time, your dedicated practice time. And then to stack and add more time value, say, okay, pause, set your alarm or put a rubber band in your wrist, or, a certain periodicity you're going to do. One, you're going to pause and you're going to just breathe through your nose for 5 minutes and be aware of the breath. So very similar things.
Very similar things. Yeah.
And so then by the end and then there's an evening practice. So when you add it all up, they practiced 45 minutes during the day or 30 minutes, but they weren't even aware because it was easy.
And integrated. And of course, the real reason we're doing this isn't so that they're paying attention to the breath when they're standing at attention. It's so that anything they're doing, they've now trained for the capacity to focus, notice, redirect, or whatever it is that they need to do. And that goes back to your question about peak mind. We have fuller access of owning our attention in this way so that we can utilize it for whatever it is that we want to do.
Right. So for a listener who has just decided they're going to buy your book, but wants to get started tomorrow or this afternoon, like where do you start? What's the practice protocol?
Yeah, so the practice protocol follows a lot of the research that we've done. And it is a prescription of 4 weeks where we ease people into these systematic practices. And I would say the first thing to do is actually counter to what I just said, start with a very low goal. So even before you begin the 4-week program, take a couple of weeks where you are starting with, if you've never done these practices before, if you think you can do 5 minutes, do a minute. Mm-hmm. And yoke it to something that is part of your daily routine and your daily habits. So it could be right before you have your cup of coffee, or right after you brush your teeth, or whatever it is. Something's already baked into the routine of your day. You're going to take that time and just integrate it in. And then the practice to do could be something like the thing you're going to end up doing for 12 minutes. So mindfulness of the breath, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about it's different than box breathing. The breath in our case with mindfulness training is one of many targets that we could use, right? We're not, and I think these are complementary, by the way. I think that the box breathing can definitely go hand in hand for other benefits, but this is where we're picking a target because it's a handy target that we don't need to fabricate or do anything.
Yeah, wherever you go, there it is.
Wherever you go, there it is. And inconspicuous, you always have it with you, and you don't have to control it for it to be there, right? So breath, oftentimes we don't have any knowledge that we're breathing, but we notice our breath-related sensations, pick something prominent, and then take this flashlight of attention, and for the minute you're going to do this, direct your flashlight right there. The intention, the goal is stay focused on those breath-related sensations.
Right.
And then the second part of the instruction is notice where your mind is. This is actually a repeat of what you were saying earlier, but that's pretty much it. Focus on breath-related sensations. Notice where your mind is. Don't beat yourself up for mind wandering. 50% of our waking moments, the mind is wandering. It's a win when you notice it. So I actually call this the find your flashlight practice, not focus your flashlight, but just find it. Because you notice where it is. Let's say it's not on breath-related sensations, then simply redirect it back. And so a lot of our military colleagues actually say, oh my gosh, Amishi, this is just a push-up. You're giving me a push-up for my mind. Focus, notice, redirect, repeat. And doing that for a minute is going to get you that win of like, I can do this. And every time you notice your mind wandering, experience the little dopamine burst of, ha, found the flashlight, get it back. So you're not obsessing over any error. You're using it as a way to efficiently get yourself back. And then build up. See if you can do more than a minute. And of course, in the book, I lay out the entire suite of practices. This one happens to be focused on the flashlight. Then we have one for the floodlight. Then we have one for the body. So it's a whole suite that kind of builds on what we've been able to do in our research studies that we've found to be effective. And you don't need to be a special operator or an elite fighter or an elite athlete to benefit. That's the good news.
That's awesome. Well, your parents would be proud. You veered from the path into the world of science and you found your way back to yoga.
I know they're doing the "I told you so" dance, I guess.
Are they aware? They're aware of your work, and I'm
oh
sure
yeah. My family's very, very excited and supportive, so I'm very lucky.
That's terrific. Well, thank you so much for your time today and your contribution. And we could go on for hours.
There's a lot of fun stuff to talk about.
I feel like we're just barely scratching the surface, of course. But I think we'd overwhelm everybody if we went any deeper than this.
It's fun, though.
I've learned so much talking to you. It's been very, very fun. And your book, Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 minutes a day, available. It's on the market. In fact, I'm going to go buy it as soon as I get off here. But I'm glad I didn't read this one in advance, because it was just more fun kind of poking and prodding, you know?
Yeah. I think
that's one of my.
Let me know what you think once you read it. I hope you.
I'd love to stay in touch. And if there's any way we can help you, please let us know. If you need a research subject and N of one, I'm here. And we have a lot of military and SEALs in our organization. So
absolutely. You're going to hear from me. You've said it now.
I've put it out there. We have a saying, it's been said. Once we say something, it's done, right? We have to do it. Where can people find more about you besides the book?
So if you remember my first name, Amishi, AMISHI.com. So they can learn all about our lab's research and more about the book, anything they want to know.
Well, that would be like a great brand for a thriving business.
There you go.
I'm mentally visualizing that right now. I'm simulating.
It's been said, Mark. It's been said.
All right, Amishi. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. This is a lot of fun. Okay, take care and keep going. I love what you're doing, and I'm so appreciative to be able to have this kind of a conversation with you.
Well, we're both just getting warmed up because the world needs this stuff right now badly.
Absolutely.
Right? All right. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. That was Dr. Amishi Jha. Check out our book, Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 minutes a day. Really, really important work. And thank you again for your attention, for focusing your attention on the Unbeatable Mind podcast and holding that attention there for this entire time. Until next time, stay unbeatable. This is Mark Divine, out.